Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with, for those of you who like your classical music in clumps, 10 essential string quartet cycles for beginners. Now, I define a clump as containing more than two works for the purposes of this talk. There are plenty of composers who wrote only two string quartets, some of them marvelous, some of them very famous. Well, we can do other talks about those, but for our purposes, we need more than two. And so the clumpy people who you absolutely have to get are, well, the people in this list. Now, before I get started, there is one major composer I wish I could include, because he wrote like 100 string quartets. I mean, what a clump that would be, but they haven't all been recorded. In fact, they're practically unknown. That composer is Luigi Boccherini, the contemporary of Haydn, who actually preceded Haydn in developing the string quartet as a medium. And unfortunately, his music is really terribly neglected and little known. And it's a shame because it's gorgeous. So I'm just throwing that out there. And I know that we're sticking to clumps, but there are some Boccherini clumps out there in the string quartet universe. So you should consider them if you want, because he wrote his music in groups of 6 or 3 or 12 or something. So he was naturally clumpy. And who knows, maybe some year someone will actually, seize the bull by the horns and do the whole batch of them and do them well, hopefully. But for our purposes, the first great clump of string quartets is Haydn's. It's the biggest. In some ways, it's still the best. It's the most amazing. There's 68 and a half of them, including the quartet version of the 7 Last Words of the Savior on the Cross, a wonderful work that he wrote for a Good Friday ceremony in Spain, which was so popular that there was an original orchestral version, there's a piano version, there's a choral version, and there's a string quartet version. But that's not the point. That doesn't matter. What matters are the regular normal string quartets, the 68 and a half of them, which are available in a box now by quite a few very fine string quartets. And boy, is this frankly, you could spend the rest of your life just listening to these. And if you're a beginner, if you're really a beginner, I need to just say, you can get them on 20 or some odd CDs. You take your time with them, very slowly, savor each one. Don't take anything for granted. These are the pieces, along with the symphonies of Haydn and other major works, that invented the language of classical music, which is essentially the language of music as we know it today. It really is. And it's just one masterpiece after another. It's such an embarrassment of riches. And I can't even begin to get into them in a talk like this, except to say that they're definitely worth having. They are all worth hearing. They begin in a lighthearted, relaxed, serenade-like vein, with pieces in 5 movements that have, lovely dance-like qualities to some of the movements. And then all of a sudden, well, it's not so much all of a sudden, he gradually worked his way into the 4-movement symphony-style string quartet that we know and love, and which his colleagues Haydn his colleagues Mozart and Beethoven and everybody else copied or learned from or built upon or something like that. But these are the iconic works for the medium, the works that invented the medium for our purposes. Like I said, Boccherini was around. There were other composers writing string quartets during this period, quite a few. There's a lot of music. There's a ton of this stuff. But Haydn's were distinctive. They were special for being as musically sophisticated as they are tuneful and charming and enjoyable to encounter. And one of the things about chamber music generally in the classical music world, it has a very snooty reputation. And people tend to prefer, or often prefer, orchestral music because you want to hear the glamour of a big orchestra with all those instruments and the gorgeous sounds it can make. But just because something is written for smaller forces doesn't mean it's smaller music. The forms are just as large. The expression is just as wide. you have to get used to attuning your listening, tuning your sensory receptors to hearing that range of expression with a different range of dynamics and tone colors. But there's always compensation with Haydn. If there isn't going to be, the extraordinary color of a big orchestra, then you have extraordinary harmony or rhythm or something. Music is not a zero-sum game. The fact that one quality is missing doesn't mean that the whole is lacking in something. And these quartets prove it better than any other works in the entire universe. So Haydn's 68.5 string quartets are where you begin if you're a beginner, and it's where you begin if you're not a beginner. After Haydn comes Mozart. Mozart wrote 23 string quartets. Now, the majority of them are early works. There are only about 9 of them, 9 or 10, I think, or so, that are mature Mozart. And the most famous Mozart quartets are the 6 quartets that he dedicated to Haydn. And when Haydn heard them, he went, wow. And he told Mozart's dad, he said, your son is the greatest musician known to me by reputation or in person. He has taste and the most wonderful knowledge of composition. Haydn heard them and was blown away. However, he didn't stop writing quartets. One of the things about Haydn was that he really knew what he could do. And he had a certain proprietary interest in the quartet. So the fact that he kept going says something, because after he encountered things like Mozart's piano concertos or his operas or whatnot, he didn't want to compete. He only competed where he knew he could compete. But anyway, Mozart's string quartets, the 6 quartets dedicated to Haydn particularly, are magnificent works. They're bigger in terms of length than Haydn's quartets. They're very, very grand. Mozart, it's very funny. Mozart is a composer who people tend to think of as, because his music is so beautiful and so it falls so gratefully on the ear, people think that he's sort of just charming. But he's so much more than that. And one of the things he really is grand. He's often bigger than Beethoven. People, look at Beethoven, it's like, that fire-breathing, Sturm und Drang, quasi-romantic, struggle, that guy with huge, Mozart is even more in many, many cases, and particularly in his chamber music, where he had the freedom to basically write however he wanted. See, one of the advantages, especially in the classical period, to writing chamber music is that you could write music that was a lot more difficult, a lot flashier, a lot more, with more bravura than you could with an orchestra, because in those days, orchestras were rather primitive, and you were lucky to get one rehearsal. And once you had that rehearsal, you were done. And the amount of actual work and forward-thinking, revolutionary musical qualities you could pack into an orchestral work was far less than what you could do in a chamber work, where you have 4 solo quality players who had unlimited rehearsal time and were making music at home, essentially, in a domestic setting for themselves or for a small group of musical connoisseurs. So you will often hear some really amazing things in chamber music that could never happen in orchestral works. And that's another one of those qualities where I say, don't think that because you're listening to 4 string players, you're getting less. You aren't. So after Mozart, we've got Beethoven, who wrote 16 string quartets. And his last quartets, the last 5 or so, are sort of on a pedestal. The pedestal is so high that my arms get cut off talking about it. The top of it is like way up there. They are revolutionary works. They are so extraordinary that they were considered completely incomprehensible back when they were originally written. When Mendelssohn was young, he loved Beethoven's last quartets, and his teachers were very concerned. They thought that was not a good influence, that they were way too spaced out and abstruse for like small children to be listening to. And they're really kind of amazing in a transcendental, and they are what they are. They are a clump. They are a subclump of the larger clump. An amazing, amazing group of works. But Beethoven's string quartets are like Haydn's in that they reveal this amazing evolution from an initial style, in Beethoven's case, the classical style of Haydn and Mozart, to something completely other that's pure Beethoven and nobody else. just amazing pieces, and they sound very modern, these late pieces, especially the extra finale to one of them. It's called the Grosse Fuga, the big fugue, which is like 15 minutes long all by itself and really ugly and difficult and scratchy sounding quite often, but incredibly powerful. And well, you can listen to it and judge for yourself. After Beethoven, we do Schubert. Now, Schubert wrote 15 string quartets, more or less, because everything Schubert wrote, he just wrote and wrote and wrote, and it never got published. And sometimes he finished things and sometimes he didn't. And Schubert, like Beethoven and Haydn, also began, I mean, remember, Schubert died when he was only about 30, 31, I think, or 32, in the same, within about a year of Beethoven. And so he was a classical period composer who yet is best known as almost a proto-romantic composer, because he was so young when he died, and so he was sort of starting further along the continuum. And he began with very classical Haydn and Mozart sounding quartets, and also wound up somewhere out there in outer space. His last three quartets, numbers 13, 14, and 15, two of them have nicknames. Rosamond, which is number 13, and Death and the Maiden is number 14, because they have slow movements that take themes from Schubert's songs of those titles. They are among the most powerful, expressively potent, gripping, and really transcendental pieces of chamber music you will ever hear in your life. But one of the great advantages of listening to these pieces in clumps is that you do get to hear the evolution. Sometimes it's really helpful if you know where a composer starts and you can follow their journey step by step until you get to these late works, which by themselves might be rather difficult unless you knew where you were coming from, unless you were able to follow the entire process. The Schubert quartets are like that, and they're very, very, very beautiful. I mean, they're all very tuneful, and he was the greatest songwriter who ever lived, so that you get great melodies throughout all of them. But in these late works that really require that you give them some attention, some serious attention, and let them sort of seep into your fiber, into your being. It's really good to be able to begin at the beginning and gradually work your way up. Now, you could start at the end and work your way back. It doesn't matter how you do it, as long as it's working for you. That's the point. But one means of entree is this idea of starting young and early and winding up, wherever their imagination takes them and us as listeners. Now, after Schubert, the great quartet composer is Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn wrote 7 quartets. Do you notice how they're getting sort of less of them? Well, actually, it's not what's going to happen, is it? Ignore what I just said. I'm looking and it's not making any sense at all. So Mendelssohn wrote 7 quartets. There's one really early one. Early for Mendelssohn means he was like 3 when he wrote it, because Mendelssohn was the greatest child prodigy since Mozart. But then he had 6 mature quartets. And those 6 mature quartets are glorious, unbelievable pieces. The first 2 are tremendously experimental for their era. Mendelssohn was writing in the 1820s and 30s for the most part, and they are based on his experience of the late quartets. That is, they have movements that run together, and they go down some very interesting paths. They're in cyclical form, meaning themes from the beginning come back at the end, and they do all kinds of wonderful, innovative things for their era, and they also sound exceptionally modern, I think, to our ears. One of the things that we always, there's a certain antiquated feel about classical music, and particularly about chamber music. You think people in like wiggy things, sitting in their wiggy thing in a drawing room with their pants with like the stockings pulled up, playing, like this, and with people sitting there like this going, oh, yes, yeah, that's so profound, it's just sublime, No, these are really visceral, exciting works. Mendelssohn's quartets really are. You'd be amazed, especially the last one in F minor, number 6. It was written in the wake of his sister's sudden death. She was quite young, so was Mendelssohn. And they were very, very, very close. And number 6 in F minor is one of the most gut-wrenching pieces of music by anybody. It's absolutely a scream of despair and rage and anguish and all of those negative qualities, which he turns into something that is hair-raisingly beautiful. Once it's over, you feel wrung out. You just go, oh my God. It's such an incredible experience. It's so emotionally intense. And, it really belies the reputation Mendelssohn has as a sort of, Victorian dandy, somebody who was very polished, but whose emotions were somehow superficial and all on the surface, that he never got into any kind of depth or anything. Oh, no. The Mendelssohn string quartets are they are the antidote to that idea. And there aren't so many of them that you can't follow them and enjoy them in a clump in a reasonable amount of time, rather than having to listen to like hundreds of pieces over the rest of your life. With Mendelssohn, Mendelssohn's a great place to start. He really is. And these pieces are terribly underrated still. But they've been getting a tremendous amount of play lately, which is good, which is really, really good. I mean, major string quartets have been playing them very beautifully and very well. So you have to have Mendelssohn string quartets. And after Mendelssohn, we're moving into a whole different world. Now, these are not strictly chronological. I mean, they're kind of chronological, sort of, kind of. Carl Nielsen. Now, Nielsen's quartets are beautiful and also underrated because they tend to be early works. There's only one that's a mature string quartet that he wrote. The others were all from the beginning of his career. He was a string player in Denmark, but they're really, really attractive and enjoyable pieces of music. It amazes me that they're so infrequently performed. It really does, because they are wonderful pieces, and again, very easy to wrap your brain around, full of charm and character and personality, and Nielsen's music all has a certain muscular vigor and freshness that you hear immediately in these works. They're really beautiful, and they deserve more attention. That's why they're on this list. They are essential works. And, in the middle of the 19th century, these are from the end of the 19th century, the 1880s and 90s, and then after the turn of the 20th century, there aren't that many composers who wrote really popular groups, clumps of string quartets that are major statements, major pieces of music that I would put on an essential list. For example, one of the most famous, who's not on the list, but I have to mention him, is Brahms. Brahms wrote 3 string quartets. He actually wrote like dozens, but he destroyed them all. They're not his most important chamber works. His most important chamber works for the most part, have either a piano with them, with strings or other instruments, or they're for larger string ensembles, sextets and quintets. And so, your best Brahms chamber works are going to be elsewhere, aside from the quartets, even though people love them, and that's okay. Another one is Tchaikovsky, who was not a composer who was known at all for writing chamber music. He wrote some exquisite pieces of chamber music. His sextet, the Souvenir de Florence, his piano trio, things like that. But his string quartets, and there are also 3 of them, are not his major works. Some of them are very attractive. So they have beautiful things in them, and you can listen to those if you want. But they are not essential. So I'm heading off that criticism at the pass. And if anybody in the comments says, you left out this, you left out that, what does it mean? It means they didn't watch the video. They just opened their mouths looking at the list and didn't actually listen to what I had to say about them. And that annoys me. So anyway, after Nielsen, we're going to jump back a little bit, just a little bit, to Dvořák. Dvořák is the great quartet composer in the second half of the 19th century, and nobody gives him credit for it. Nobody. He wrote 14 string quartets. Some of them are, and he also had other things like the cypresses for string quartet, short song arrangements that he made for string quartet. There are some individual quartet movements. There are a couple quartets that he wrote when he was quite young, and they are wildly experimental. Insanely experimental. His 3rd quartet, which is like 1 hour and 10 minutes long. The 4th quartet, which sounds like late Wagner, before late Wagner was late Wagner. The 4th quartet's amazing. It's a single 30-minute movement that may be based also on Dvořák's knowledge of the early, the first 2 Mendelssohn quartets. But oh my goodness, that's a great work. And it has a central slow movement, an andante religioso, that became his notturno for string orchestra. Gorgeous slow movement. Fascinating music in these quartets. But then after about number 7 or so, or 8, he found his footing, and the next 7 or 8 include some of the most popular works in the medium, like the American Quartet, which is incredibly beautiful, the Slavonic Quartet, which was number 10. He dedicated one to Brahms. Brahms wrote back to him and said, "Oh, it's lovely, it's beautiful, thank you for the dedication, but be careful of your part writing," because Brahms was nothing if not pedantic when he was talking about the work of other composers. And the last 2 Dvořák quartets, 13 and 14, which have no title, which are 2 of the greatest pieces of chamber music in the entire 19th century. And they get no credit, they get no love from anybody, and they're so enjoyable. All of Dvořák's music is wonderful to listen to. He was one of the greatest tunesmiths after Schubert. Some extraordinary music in these quartets, absolutely amazing, and he doesn't get credit for being as great as he was in this repertoire because why? Well, because he wasn't German, and string quartets were supposed to be like German things that German people did Germanically, but Dvořák did them Czechishly, and he's never been forgiven for that in the politics that is the world of classical music understanding, appreciation, and scholarship. But these 14 quartets are epic, absolutely epic, and they've been gorgeously recorded a couple times, so they're easy to find. After Dvořák, another Czech guy, Bohuslav Martinu. Martinu wrote 7 string quartets, and they also follow his style from his early French Impressionist, Debussy and Ravel kind of. They each wrote 1 string quartet, by the way. Debussy and Ravel's string quartet style, this lovely, hazy, foggy, somewhat amorphous string quartet style, to his neoclassical style full of motoric rhythms and spiky harmonies, to a synthesis of that with Czech folk music and other things. His last quartet is known as a chamber concerto, Concerto da Camera, because of its concerto-like highlight of specific instrumental parts. They are wonderful to listen to, enormous fun. None of them are terribly long. One of them, the 5th, is a very dark, wartime, creepy, spooky, anguished work, quite similar to his double concerto for 2-string orchestras, piano and timpani. There's a wide range of expression in these works, and they're colorful, and they don't sound like anybody else. It's a wonderful body of work to get to know. There'll be a real discovery. When you listen to them, you'll just go, "Oh, that's different, that's special." And you'll either like the style or you won't like the style, but it is special. So after Martinu, we have to do Bartók. Now, Bartók's string quartets were the essential 20th century string quartet cycle for most of the first 2/3 of the 20th century. There are 6 of them. They also have their roots in late Beethoven and also late Wagner, a very chromatic style. That is one which has a lot of dissonance, a lot of disruptive and troubled harmony. They can be tough to take. They require a certain amount of patience and fortitude on the part of the listener, especially after you get into 3, 4, and 5, which are the heart of his quartet style. They use an amazing amount of high-level dissonance mixed with Hungarian folk rhythms and Hungarian folk harmonies, with a very strict formal control of each work. I mean, they're amazing pieces. Not quite as popular or as talked about, I think, as they used to be, but they are well worth getting to know. And they are, once you get to know them, once you listen to them, and it takes some effort. I'm telling you, Mr. and Mrs. Beginner, they do take some effort, but they'll be worth your time. They really were. They really are. I mean, they're amazing pieces and essential for anybody who loves chamber music or loves string quartets. And you get them in a clump. They all fit on 2 CDs. If you're getting physical product, if you're streaming, it doesn't matter. But after Bartók, the Bartók quartets have been slightly shoved off of their pedestal by the 15 string quartets of Shostakovich. An amazing cycle of work, 15 of these suckers. he began by writing a very simple, lovely little quartet. It was sort of an experiment for him. And then he began to see the possibilities of the medium. And he began to write a series in which it looked like, at the time that he died, he was writing one string quartet in every major and minor key. And he only got through 15. There would have been 24, probably, had he lived. And every piece he wrote, Shostakovich is a fascinating composer, for all of the problems he had with the Soviet regime and his own, questions about how his own style was evolving and whatnot. He never repeated himself. He was a composer who was constantly exploring things that were new and fresh. But his later style got very, very spacey and very dark and very bleak. The last quartet is something like 5 adagios or largos followed by a funeral march. It's like in 6 movements. They're all slow. They're all spooky. But it's funny. When you listen to it, it's not hard to listen to. At least I don't think so. I mean, you may want to commit suicide when it's over. It's dark. But it goes so directly. It speaks so directly to us. And one of the things that Shostakovich was able to do in his chamber music is he didn't have to make concessions. He didn't have to make concessions to socialist, realist ideology. He was under tremendous pressure from the communist regime to join the Communist Party, to write heroic symphonies in praise of Lenin and Stalin and all, which he never really did either. But he had to scoot around the idea in his big orchestral pieces. Nobody expects that someone's going to write a string quartet that's going to be, a hymn to the virtues of Marxist-Leninist ideology. I mean, they just don't. So Shostakovich was able to put some of his most private thoughts into his string quartets, including the harrowing 8th quartet, which uses motives that appear in many of his other works, including his musical initials, a 4-note motive, da, 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 based on the initials of his name, and a tune that later pops up in his second piano trio and in other pieces besides. There's some of his Jewish themes that he always used when he wanted to express tragedy through dance music. Really, they are an amazing body of work. One of my very favorites is the 3rd, which is a big, bold symphonic piece. It's one of those wonderful pieces. It begins in the utmost simplicity with just a yum bum 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 ba-da-dum 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 ba da-da-da-dum bum ba-da-dum. I mean, it could be almost a tune by Mozart, da-da-dum ba-da-dum ba-da-da-da da-da-dum 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 da. The Mozart G minor symphony, well, the Shostakovich is da-da-dum ba-da-dum ba-da-dum ba. There's that glance at the classical style with a sardonic or sly edge, but then it develops in ways that are quite sophisticated and obviously 20th century. Just an amazing body of work. And with that, we come to an end of this series of 10 essential string quartet cycles for beginners. This is for people who are major, serious clumpists. But just because you're a beginner, it doesn't mean you can't clump. Clump away. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.